The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Jillian Schaefer, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for SWK Technologies. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Sage Fixed Assets Depreciation and the Impact of the CARES Act, presented by Jason Konopak of SWK Technologies. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute to keep the background noise down. However, you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. To submit a question, look for the questions section in your GoToWebinar. We will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording this presentation and it will be distributed tomorrow to all attendees as well as to those who registered but were not able to attend. Please take a moment at the end of the presentation to answer our 2-question survey. With that said, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend our webinar. We're here to help you get the most out of your software solutions and help you find an easier way to run your business by providing you software and industry knowledge, tools, and support whenever you need it. So whether you're here doing research for a new solution or you're just here to learn, we'd like to encourage you to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Lastly, as a quick reminder, SWK is constantly sharing important updates and software tips and tricks on our social media channels. So we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jason.
All right. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you for the introduction. As she said, my name is Jason Konopak. Let me bring up my slide here. I am a Sage 100 consultant with SWK, as well as a Sage Fixed Assets consultant. And today we're just going to go over some of the basics of the Fixed Assets Depreciation Program itself. And then we'll also touch on some tips and some recommendations I have, some common things I encounter when helping my clients with their fixed assets depreciation installation. And we'll also talk about the CARES Act and one pretty crucial change in that act that can really impact your bottom line when it comes to your tax returns related to your assets and their depreciation. So with that said, I will go ahead and get started. All right, so we're just going to talk about, like I said, we're going to do a little bit of a overview and a little demo of fixed assets, and I'll jump back after we go over fast a little bit and come back to this presentation, talk about the CARES Act, and then we'll jump back into the demo and show you an example of what the implications of that CARES Act are. And then at the end, as Jolene said, we will do a little bit of a Q&A. All right, so I will jump back out of this and go over to my fixed assets demo. So what is fixed assets? And in my day-to-day, I tend to use FAS, F-A-S, or fixed assets to refer to the fixed assets depreciation program that Sage provides. Sage does actually provide 3 different programs related to fixed assets, depreciation being one of those 3. This is where you actually will manage your assets, do your calculations for your depreciation every month, add new assets, etc. The other 2 modules are called planning and tracking. In planning, we can have the ability to track construction or work in progress, and then at the end of that, all of those costs for that project can be rolled up into one asset that can then be sent over into depreciation. And then tracking is a way for you to manage your inventory of your assets by printing out labels, doing physical counts, and having the results of those counts impact what assets are or are not listed in your depreciation module. But the depreciation module is the key component and is the one where most of the discussion occurs. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We can leave planning and tracking for a later date at this point. One additional add-on that you may have available to you is reporting, and that is similar to if you're a user of Sage 100 or other Sage products, for example, you can edit your reports, make custom reports using Crystal reports. So the reporting module for fixed assets will also allow you to do that with your stock fixed assets reports or create new ones completely from scratch using your data. And then if we focus again on depreciation, there's 4 different versions of the program in case you're not familiar with them. Starting with the simplest, which is light depreciation. That's a single user. You can max out at only 1,000 assets for that application. So in my working with clients, I don't tend to see a lot of that because people don't want to limit themselves to that version. A next step up would be the single user version, where it's very similar, just one user, but you don't have a limit on the number of assets. If you need to bump that up and have multiple users in your system, then we would jump up to the depreciation network version, where we would install fixed assets on your server and then client components on each workstation for each user that needs to access it. And then lastly is the Premier version. It operates very similarly from the front end, from the user perspective, as the network version, but with the one difference being that it operates with a SQL database backend. Whereas network just uses a flat file database file that is just stored on your server. The Premier version will actually use SQL Server, and that will very much help with performance if you have over about 10,000 assets in each database. That's kind of the cutting point where you definitely want to move to Premier if you have a large number of assets, like 10,000 or more. So that's the different versions of fixed assets, just to give a quick overview of what your options in case you weren't aware. But now I'll cut over to the demo and show you the program. So in my demo here, I have the depreciation network version. This is just on a virtual machine, so I could have installed any of those versions just fine. This is the most common one you see in the field, so it's the one I'm most familiar with. But the take-home point there is the interface is going to be exactly the same once you're using it. Depending on no matter what version you're using, you're going to see this same basic interface. So this will apply to everyone using the more modern versions of fixed assets. Currently, we're on version 2020.1, which was released earlier in the late winter, early spring. So Sage typically does release a new version around that time each year. They may come out with an update at some point during the year if there is any crucial information or bug fixes or tax changes that definitely need to be included for that tax year. In this case, we did just have the one release, 2020.1. There is a minor update that just adds some changes to tax reporting. So if you do use the tax book for actual tax reporting to your IRS, or if you're using that information to send to your tax accountants, either way, I would definitely strongly recommend that you be on the latest version of Sage Fixed Assets Depreciation. So please reach out to us if we at SWK are your business partner for fixed assets, or reach out to Sage directly, or whoever your business partner may be. So as far as Sage setup goes, Sage Fixed Assets, we've got our main screen here for our sample company, which shows our asset list. And I won't go into too much detail here, but this spreadsheet is very useful to give you a breakdown of all of your assets in a full list. So I can scroll up and down on this list and get to where I need to be. And you can see all of your fields from left to right. All of these are going to be your general fields that are identifying information about the assets. There is a new feature in the 2020 version where you can add fields from your book calculations. So in previous versions, up until and through 2019, you would only see what Sage calls the general information fields on this screen. So descriptive fields, the GL accounts, the sorting things by location or department, all that information will be on here. But now you can see we've got these fields with asterisks are your, in this case, acquired value, estimated life, net book value, current accum. And you can see with the asterisk, those are referring to the internal book. And so that can be accessed by going to here, custom asset list. And you can modify what we're seeing here. So you can see what we have on the right. These are the 4 starred fields we have. You can add any of these other depreciation calculation or critical fields in, so you don't have to necessarily run a report or go into the asset detail list or asset detail screen to be able to see this information. So that's a nice, useful addition that Sage provided this year. Speaking of the asset detail screen, so if we want to look at the actual nuts and bolts of what has been happening with the calculation of any asset, we can highlight that asset and click asset detail. We can also double click it on that particular line or go to the asset file menu and do asset detail. I'm going to just go and highlight that and do asset detail, but I find myself doing any of those functions depending on what I feel like doing, I suppose. So on the asset detail screen, you can see we've got some organization by asset, by system number. The key thing here that I want to show you is we've got a few different tabs here for more information about the asset. We can see if there are any disposals or transfers done on this asset using this transactions tab. Your users can keep notes here and add notes, say modified acquisition value on August 12th. So you could enter that note and you would be able to add that into the bottom here. So something very simple like that, add note, and there's my note. And you can go ahead and edit those or delete them as well. You can also save link images to the asset using the image manager. And so whenever we have an asset that has images, we can find that and see a preview here. So I think one of these has it. I'll go back to the main screen, asset list. Right here, asset number 3, you can see by this little paperclip that we've got an image attached. So I'll double click on that and there we see an image. So this is a patent in this case. You can keep your PDFs of invoices for the asset when you purchased it, receipts, instruction manuals, MSDS, a picture of the asset, of course. So anything that you feel is relevant to keep a record of, you can include in here. So just as an aside, the reason I tell you all of this is because I've encountered a lot of clients that want to come into using Sage Fixed Assets for the first time from using Microsoft Excel or something similar to track their depreciation. So there's a lot of people out there that will use Excel and create their own formulas, and that's fine. If you're just doing straight line methods, it's a very easy calculation. If you're good at Excel, it's easy to keep track of things like that. So some of the things I'll show you today will differentiate between just a basic Excel workbook can do and what you can do in fixed assets. So as an example, attaching images, while it's possible with some hyperlinks in Excel, it can get a little clunky. All right, so other than the images, we've got the history tab. This is great for auditing. So if somebody has changed things, like remember in my note on that other one, not with this one, I had written modified acquisition value. So you'd also see that on this screen, and it would show you which user modified that that field. And you can click detail and see a little bit more information about that as well. So that's good for auditing purposes. All right, so let's go back to the screen. Let's go back to the main asset detail screen. And if you're already Sage user or fixed assets users, I'm sure you're aware of how this works, but just for an overview for anybody that doesn't use it or is not that familiar, in the program, you can track up to 7 different parallel books for your assets. So the most common, as you see up front, are tax and internal. So tax, if you're reporting to the IRS, depending on your state, you may want to do a state book as well. And I'm not a tax accountant, but I believe that the AMT, Alternative Minimum Tax Book, is no longer required, but I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me on anything related to tax because I am not a tax accountant. But you can track your tax book here, your internal book here. You can also use these last 2 custom books for any reason you would like. You can experiment with different depreciation methods. You can track a budget in this other book, for example. So this leaves a little bit of flexibility for you in this case. Within each book, as I mentioned before, there are critical fields. So these 5 critical fields are the basis for all of the calculations that fixed assets will perform every time you run a monthly calculation. So those are our key fields. Every asset needs those set. If you ever change those, then you're going to change the calculation, and you may need to rerun your calculations. And then at the bottom, you see these blue bold fields are the results of the calculations. I can't click and edit them because they are locked in by the calculation. If anything in here is not correct for you, then you may need to make an adjustment by changing some of these values here. You can throw in beginning information, which essentially will lock a date and an accumulation to date for whatever you choose, and then the system will calculate from there forward. So it gives you some flexibility, but again, these are not editable because they're the results of the calculation. So I'm going to go back to the main screen and show you some additional customization options you have with this program. So first of all, you can see here our top half of our detail screen, we have at the bottom some custom fields. And you can see this says 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This data set is a sample company that Sage provides that already has some customization in it. So custom fields 1, 2, and 3 are already taken. So we can go into our field customizer and see what we have happening there. So you can see here is our list of custom fields. In this case, the demo system here has state in use for custom field 1. So it's not one of the default fields available to you out of the box, but you can use this and say, let me put a state in. So I want to keep track of what state my asset is in if you have a wide-ranging organization. And you can change how many characters are allowed. So in this case, there's just 2 characters allowed for state. And you can go a step further for your customization. You can determine where on that screen behind me here, in what order it shows up. So state is 18th, and that's where that ends up lying, starting from the top and going left to right down. So 18th field right there, determined by this. The next thing I want to show you is Smart List. So I always encourage my clients to use Smart List for any fields that are very crucial that they get them entered properly. Now, this demo data has the Smart List set up for states, and this fake company must use just 5 or 4 states, so it's restricted to just those 4, and it gives you a nice description for the user when they select from a drop-down menu. So if I back out here real quick and show you, when I click on this field, if I were adding a new asset, it's going to mean I can only drop down and select one of these 4 states. So there's no room for error. I accidentally type in, say, VI, which is not the state code for Virginia. So I don't let my users make that mistake by using this Smart List. But to go back into there, I strongly recommend this to all my clients for their GL accounts, especially if they're using the report that we can put out of fixed assets to create their journal entries, and definitely if they are using fixed assets to link directly up to their ERP system. Most commonly with our clients would be Sage 100. So I'll show you what that is. We'll do asset account in this case. So I'll go into the Smart List Manager. So again, we can say on our GL, we only want to use these accounts for our asset accounts. And so that means that the users will only be able to use these accounts. They can't accidentally leave these dashes out in between. They can't accidentally do 1601, leave the 0 off and just do 160. That would result in a very bad, erroneous journal posting if we were posting the results of our depreciation into our ERP. So what you can see here is we've restricted entry to only include these. You can add more. So if you create new accounts, you can just go ahead and add one of those accounts here. So say we do 1700 and whatever our test is. And so there, now we've got a new entry that's also allowed. If it's something that's not as restrictive, you can go ahead and do auto add, and that'll prompt the user. I would keep it on confirm. So if they enter something different, you can pop up and say, do you want to add this to the Smart List? So depending on the importance of the field, you can change these settings. All right, so there's your Smart List. I'll go back to our main asset list. One of the other very useful things about the functionality in here is grouping your assets. So you can see in our test data, we've got 100 assets here, and we can scroll down, we can look at each of these. But say we wanted to only look at assets that were in the HQ location. Say we had issues with our calculation last month for HQ, and we want to figure out which of our assets has given us a problem. So we could filter our list by HQ. Well, you do that by creating groups. And it looks like I've done this before, so I have group HQ. So I can just select my group from here, do HQ, and it's going to filter this. So now instead of having all 100 of my assets, you can see in the top right, I've got 48 assets, and down at the bottom, I've got record 1 of 48. And so you can click on these, and I can scroll over, of course, and see that all of these are my location HQ. And so you can just use some very simple logic to create additional groups using Group Manager. We'll ignore that. So let's say, let me get this back to the main group, and we want to do a different group. So let's do location SL, just to keep it simple. So I'll go back into my Group Manager, and we'll call this, we'll be a little bit more descriptive, location SL. Add that. Now that's in my list of groups. Oops, I may have lost my screen here. One moment. Sorry about that. All right, there it is. Sorry about that. I'm on a virtual machine and I went outside of the window. Okay, we're back. So we are on our location SL adding this group. So I'm going to look for my location in my field to filter on. There's location. And we have many different options for our operator here. So I have a lot of possibilities. We could do equals, of course. We could do is. We could do a begins with or ends with if we want to be a little bit more flexible. Depending on the text field, that might be useful. In this case, I think equals is all we need. The system knows what fields we have currently, so I can just choose SL for our sales location, add that, and now this is the filter that will be applied. If you add multiple filters, you can use and or logic to apply to them down here as well. We'll keep it simple with SL. And now I close my list manager, and now I have location SL as my filter, and now I just see SL. So again, that can be very useful for printing reports, running calculations just on a group of assets. And as you could see from the logic in there, you don't have to just filter on location. You can filter on any number of things: when the asset was acquired, what's the asset ID, is it active or not, etc. So again, to differentiate between both Excel and maybe some other fixed asset programs you may have used in the past, with Sage FAS, you can add assets to your system any number of different ways. So you can add them kind of most visibly right here is in your task pane on the top left, add an asset. So you can click on that, enter your information, set up with your critical fields, of course. Don't forget your acquisition date as well. That is needed. I won't waste our time going through an example here. If you already used the program, I'm sure you know how to do this. If you're just getting started or aren't sure, reach out to us. We'll give you a hand with setting them up. But in addition to doing that, you can, of course, add an asset from the menu here. You can also add them from a template. So you can use templates here, and these are customizable by you. These are just what currently exist in our demo data. So say I'm adding a new laptop, it's going to already fill out a lot of information for us. All laptops will report to specific GL accounts, have a generic description, etc. So you can save some time with your entry using a template. You can also import assets. So prime example for those clients of ours that are using Excel, when we bring them over to Sage Fixed Assets, we'll go ahead and do a file custom import, and we can refer to that Excel sheet. As long as we've got all of our fields prepared in the right order and in the right format, we can bring that data in from Excel or a CSV, a couple other formats as well, and run an import there. Again, I won't go through the details on that. It's a little esoteric. And then lastly, what may be useful to some of you is you can add assets from your ERP system. So the biggest benefit, if you're already on Sage 100, Sage 300, 500, etc., is the ability to link between the two programs. So there's some caveats. They need to be installed on the same server, and you also need to have a workstation installation in place for both. Those factors vary depending on your version. So you want to reach out to your business partner if it's not SWK, and make sure you've got the right game plan for that. But you can see you can create links here, and then asset addition links as well. So in this case, we can really just link automatically to Sage 300 and 100. And so what that will do is when you create a AP invoice or a purchase order, we can apply a template to those line items. And when you process that invoice or purchase order, as you can see here, AP PO link, it's going to then send that information over to the fixed assets program as new assets. I would recommend after you do that to just come back into Sage Fixed Assets and check out the new assets that were added. You may need to modify them if you didn't quite capture all of the details in your ERP. But that can save you a lot of time if that's the normal way you acquire and add assets is through POs and AP invoices in your Sage system. All right, so lots of flexibility for adding assets as well. In the interest of time, let's go ahead and do a quick calculation. So I'll go back to my full group just so we see everything. I'll do all complete assets. So again, just like with adding assets or changing screens, we got a few different ways we can do this for calculating depreciation. So let's just take a look at any of our live assets. I just want to see where I left off with this company. So we are current through December 2019. You can also check that under reports, current reporting period, and that is going to reflect where you currently have done your calculations. You can see I've done some testing on here recently, and it's updated my internal book through April 30. But I'm going to go ahead and bring all of my internal book assets back to 12/2019. So seeing that my reporting period is off, I can go ahead and realign all my assets to where I want them to be. And I will do that going all complete assets. Again, see, we can select our group. So now we created our location SL. We could do our calculation just on that one. We don't need to do everything or just one at a time. We can do this by group. All right, so I'm going to do internal group, internal book, set my December 2019 date. And at this point, I just want to bring everything in line. I don't need to see a report right now. So the automatic function of our depreciation calculation is going to want to give us a depreciation expense report. If you have any custom ones, you can see those here as well. Because that's the normal process. When you run your month, you're going to print your reports. And then you would do send to window to give yourself a preview. If you're brave and want to just print it right to your printer, you can check that. But in this case, I just want to run the calculation itself. So I'm going to uncheck window, hit OK. We'll see our little progress bar flash up very quickly. And now all of my assets for the internal book are through 12/2019. And you can see I've updated my current reporting period. So if I back out of that, now I can see my current reporting period is the end of last year. So then if I want to go ahead and run the next month, I'll go ahead and do all assets. I'll stick to just internal. I'll do January 2020. And now I want to see my report. Now I can send this to my window. All right, so there's my report. This is the standard out-of-the-box report. As I mentioned at the top of our webinar, we can add the reporting module and allow you to customize some of this information. So if you wanted to see, instead of the system number, your asset ID, that's a common request. We'll need to add the reporting module to do some customizing, pull this out, add the asset ID in. And again, if you wanted to change any of these fields here, you can do so with the reporting module customizer. But I won't bore you with reviewing the report. Again, if you guys have used this before or used it in another system, I'm sure you're familiar with all of that. All right, so I'm just going to cancel out of that. Now we've done our calculation through. Another big tip here that I do recommend, I find a lot of my clients are not doing, is doing period close. So period close is important in that it will prevent you from, if you make any changes, adjustments, modify any of your critical fields, the system is not going to reflect those changes back to months prior to your period close. So if I've just now closed 2019, as I just did with my calculation, I've finalized all of my 2019 reports for year end, and I don't want anything to change. If somebody goes in and takes this asset and says, oh, well, this asset is actually not worth 20,000, it's worth 24,000, and they go ahead and run this calculation, they may accidentally change this to where through 2019 we have a different accum. Maybe not a great example, this one's fully depreciated, but you get the point that this can change your previous results. The key point here about the program is FAST does not record your history anywhere. So if you're using Sage 100, for example, you have a full history of all of your invoices and the payments and your GL accounts and the orders and your purchase orders, etc. You have all of that history. In FAST, these fields that you see here with these results, it is only going to keep the most recent result of that. So right now, it only knows that I've gone through January 2020 and I've accumulated 20,000. It can use the basic math that's set up by our critical fields and easily recalculate if you want to go back and recalculate a previous period. But if you've made an adjustment and now we're recalculating and going back to, say, July, where the adjustment had not happened yet, then my reprint of a report from here won't match. So I always urge my clients to close their years, close their periods, make a backup, make an archive copy of that company file as well, and I can show you how that works briefly. And save your reports as well. Export your depreciation expense report, your GL posting, any other reports you deem critical. Save them as PDFs, save them as Excel files, so you have those records. And of course, you will also have the record of that transaction in your ERP system if you've brought this data into your GL. All right, enough preaching about my recommendations there. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the CARES Act. I will go back into my presentation and get this started. All right, so CARES Act. So the CARES Act came out through the coronavirus, it stands for Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, in case anyone forgot. That was signed into law on March 27th of this year, and this included a lot of changes for the country's economy. There was one small change that they made in the act that affected fixed assets, and that applies to what is now currently known as qualified improvement properties. So before the 2017 Tax Cares and Jobs Act that renamed, kind of consolidated the categorizing of retail property, restaurant property, and leasehold improvements into this QIP, qualified improvement property. So that's what they are all classified as now, according to the IRS. When they did that and made that change in the Tax Cares and Jobs Act, as the Act says, the CARES Act says, there was an error made, and it meant that all of these assets had to be, in your tax book, according to the IRS, recorded with an estimated life of 39 years. So I'm gonna sneak forward and show you this on the next slide. So this is, I found this actual snippet from the CARES Act this March, which for a government document was very clear and easy to understand, that there was apparently a technical error that it changed your ability to depreciate these over 15 years to back up to 39 years. And as you can see there at the bottom of that paragraph, it means now that they fixed this and brought us back down to be able to use a 15-year term for our maker's depreciation method, now we can also take the 168 allowance on these assets. And so I'll go back to my screen here, and just in summary, we can, any of your assets that were placed in service after December 31st, so 2018, 2019, 2020, and you had them, if they were qualified improvement properties, and if you had them at 39 years, you can make the adjustment, change them to 15 years, and if appropriate, take the 168 allowance as well. So again, my enormous caveat here, I am not your tax accountant, I am not a CPA, so this is something to bring up to your tax accountants, that this is a possibility now. There are also options that the IRS will allow you to rectify previous years. This is backwards compatible, so to speak, coming from an IT perspective. So again, I don't have the direct answer on how you should change your assets and change your tax return. Go to your accountants for that. But it's already possible in either the 2019 or 2020 fixed assets depreciation program to make this change. You don't need an update. You don't need to make any changes. But if you're using FAS for your taxes, definitely be on the latest version. So the issue would be moot at that point. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Here is a quick example, and as you can see my link on the bottom, Carl from Sage provided a post summarizing all of this on Sage City. So this is the link to that blog post where I'm getting a lot of this information. So a great example he provided. So before the CARES Act, if we were following the Tax Cares and Jobs Act rules for qualified improvement properties, we would have a 39-year asset under the MF makers formula. And in our first year, since we can't take bonus depreciation and it's spread out over 39 years, this is our first year depreciation, 2457, assuming a 21% tax rate. That tax offset is only $516. You can see after the change, if we've gone ahead and taken that 100% bonus, we're collecting, in this case for a $100,000 asset, we're collecting all of that depreciation as bonus in our first year, and that's a $21,000 deduction to taxable income. So very big difference there, and again, review that with your tax accountants, and that could be a big change for you here. So if you weren't aware of that since March, that can really affect your books. All right, and then let me just show you an example of that. I'll just basically work through how that example works in our fixed assets application here. So I went ahead and created an asset for us called CARES Act, asset number 101. And we have this asset set up in our tax book. So just like their example, it is placed in service at the start of this 2019 year, $100,000. This is before we knew about the CARES Act. We're at MF 100, so that's a 39-year estimated life. And we've gone ahead and calculated that through the end of the year, 12/2019, and we've got a depreciation of 2457. So that matches that first example, if we just go back to that slide, the 2457. And now if I go ahead and make my change, then we can see the difference. So we now will have the ability to take our 168 allowance, so I can switch this to MA, which allows the allowance, to be redundant. I can hit tab and prompt my critical depreciation change. So I'm going to say yes. We're going to reflect this as of our placed in service date. and we're going to rerun our calculation here. So you're going to get this message. We're going to be able to ignore this because of the new tax rules. And so I can now change this to 15. And I believe the ADS now is 20. And now you can see we can use our 168 all the way up to 100 if we wish to. And so there's our 168. I can hit save my changes, calculate this guy. So I'm just going to calculate just on my asset for tax book. And I'm going to still just go to 2019 to be parallel. And again, I don't need to see a depreciation expense report. And hit OK. So there we go. And now you can see we've done our 100,000 allowance. We have no more net book value. So there we go. We've made a big change based on that rule change from the CARES Act. All right. So that is all I have for the CARES Act. I want to show you a couple more things since we have a little bit of time in fixed assets, some of the things I've run across. So let me see. I think the first thing I want to go over is security. I did a webinar on this fixed assets a year ago, and I didn't have time to go over security, so I'm going to go over security. Out of the box, for instance, if you're using a network version, if you have multiple users, that's the best scenario where you would want to have security on your system. So Network or Premier is a multi-user application. So out of the box, you're going to purchase X number of license to allow multiple users to use your system. Once that program is installed on their machine, they have, by default, full reign of the program. Now, in my experience, we have only CFOs, controllers, and head accountants usually running this. So the limitation of whether they have it installed on the machine or not is often good enough for many of my clients. And that's fine. If you have a larger number of users accessing the system, if you want to limit their access to certain tasks like running the calculation, adding or deleting assets, access to or not to certain companies, you can set that up in the System Administration tab. And you can set that up using Manage Supervisor settings. That is the first thing we're always going to be doing. And you can see here, this is my tip number one about this. If you're thinking about setting this up, if you go ahead and start doing this on your own and you say, okay, we're going to need a password for this, this password must be saved somewhere in your password saver, whatever your organization's rules are. Do not forget this password. It's not the end of the world. You can reach out to Sage if you lose this, and they can provide you a password if you're the right contact that they have on file with your account. But we don't want to have to do that. So save your password. In this case, well, let me just do webinar. I can remember that. And since this is not anything secure, go to my notepad and just write that down. Don't do that in real life with a real password. That's no. But just in case I forget, I'll save that. All right, so then we get in here. We can set up security for either Windows authentication or application authentication. So we can set this up to say if Bob and Janet are the only users that should ever use this, we can just say if they're on our Windows domain, we can allow only that user to access. So that would be whether they have their login to their actual computer, that login will be allowed or not. Application is a more program-specific password, so you can create your own user accounts in here for specific users. Let me just go ahead and enable that, and we'll do application authentication. And then, as you can see here, we can do company-based security as well. So we can set up security for individual companies and run from there. I'm going to back out. It'll be a little bit too detailed to go over all of these, but I'll just give you an overview. You could create a profile, so system-wide profile, say, someone who has view-only access or someone who has full access except for X or Y. You can set up a profile and assign a user a profile. And then that's the same thing can go for company-specific profiles. So that's security. So something to keep in mind if you have multiple users and you're currently not using anything, might be a good idea to get a little bit more granular and specific with your security. All right, one other recommendation I have. So I've talked a lot today about the data structure and how making adjustments, making changes can retroactively change what the FAST data reports as. So, oh, I did not even show you period close. Let me show you period close. So very quickly, I rambled a little bit there. Depreciate, period close, set period close. And you can see that this is just going to tell us that anything that has been processed past our close date is not going to get closed. So we want to close after we've confirmed all of our assets through a certain date. So in this case, we're through 2019, 12/2019, based on that calculation I did earlier. So we want to close period 12/2019. So I'm going to do all complete assets. We can do all books, 12/2019. Again, we don't need to run a report here. We can just do OK. And that's fine. There's some exceptions. But if we go into most of our assets, we'll see at the bottom, no, we don't. Not that one. That one's not a good one. So here are the CARES Act example I used. We did a period close through 12/2019. And so that means if I go ahead and just like I did and modify my depreciation method or my estimated life or value, it's going to ask me, do I want to depreciate as of the period close going forward, or do I want to lift that period close and go back even further, such as to my placed in service date? So it's just an added measure of protection against your data being modified when you don't want it to be. And then related to adjustments, which I was going to mention a second ago, is always know your options for your adjustment type. So if you go into File, Edit Company, and you look at your company and you go to Book Overrides. So for each of your books, you're going to have an option for an adjustment. Out of the box, your adjustment is going to be none. So this applies to underdepreciated assets. So if your asset if you've made a change and suddenly through a certain date, you've not depreciated as much as the calculation now says you could take, you can make up that difference of your underdepreciation either not at all with the setting none, or you could do an immediate adjustment, which I have set up for this test company. Immediate adjustment will take all of that difference and put it into your next month's calculation. So say if I was under depreciated by $100 through December 2019, and my normal period was $50. In January 2020, I'm going to take $150 depreciation to make up for my lost $100 that was under depreciated. So that's what immediate does. Post recovery will do the same thing, except it's going to put it in the first period after the end of life, the first period of the first year after the end of life of the asset. So depending on your needs for your books, you can take that at either of those times. And then another alternate option is to, if you're in an internal book, let me find one that's open, you can change this to RV, remaining value. And so that will just do a straight calculation of how much net book value is left, how many periods are left before this is out of life, and it applies that fraction each period along the way until you reach 0. So that's another adjustment option to do remaining value. All right, a couple of new features here. I actually already showed you a little bit ahead of my plan. I showed you these ability to add your calculation fields into your asset list screen. So we already went over that. One final quick new feature that can be very useful if you tend to make a lot of changes and adjustments as things develop is the ability to bulk edit your depreciation fields, namely your method and your estimated life. So this was not a feature until the 2020 version. You can see it always is going to prompt for a backup. Say I just want to change in my internal book, and we'll do all assets. I'll back out before I complete that, but just want to show you, you can change either depreciation method and or estimated life, and it'll take, say, all of them that are currently set at straight line, and say you just want to change this from the regular straight line to straight line full month. You could do that for all assets. You could that already have straight line as their method, so it's not going to change. Say something's on RV remaining value, it's not going to change that one. It'll only change those that meet this first criteria. And so then you can run through this, and it'll actually make a bulk change. Before this version, you had to go in individually and make all of those changes. All right, so I believe that is all I wish to cover for today. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I think that is just about right for Q&A.
Thank you, Jason. We'll now open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please enter them into your questions section of GoToWebinar, and we'll give that a minute in case any come through. And just a reminder, everyone, we do have a subject matter expert here. This is a great opportunity to have your questions answered in real time. And Jason, we do have one that has come through.
Okay.
Can you have a direct link with Sage 50?
Sage 50, that's a good question. I don't believe there is a direct link with Sage 50. I have there's a document that Sage provides that lists all of the links. Let me open that up and just double check. Yes, there is a link to Sage 50. My apologies. As a Sage 100 consultant, I don't often work with Sage 50. But yes, there is a link available there, so that is possible.
And we have another question that's come through. Will this webinar be available to watch later? Yes, this webinar will be distributed tomorrow to all attendees as well as to those who registered but were not able to attend. And I think that's all the questions we have, so thank you so much, Jason, for your informative presentation and for taking the time to be here today.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thanks, Jolene, for organizing.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.